Every festive season, like most normal people, we at TLDR get a pang of political nostalgia for the Brexit days of old. We're reminded of Theresa May's first no-confidence vote in December 2018, Boris Johnson's landslide victory a year later, and the 1,246-page EU-UK trade deal published on Boxing Day a year after that, only a couple of days before the transition period expired on New Year's Eve. So, 5 years on from the deal and nearly 10 years on from the referendum, we thought we'd do a little retrospective and take a look at how Brexit's going. Hint, not brilliantly. Long-time TLDR fans will remember that 5 years ago we released a book called Brexit the Colouring Book, a tongue-in-cheek, COVID-inspired way to relive the Brexit process through drawings and a detailed timeline written by our team. Well, we've reprinted the book, refreshed all of the timeline and added some extra pages, and it's available right now in our store, and get 20% off for a limited time using code YouTube20. So, there are sort of two ways of evaluating Brexit: economically and politically. Let's start with the economic impact. As you might remember, in the lead up to the 2016 referendum, a number of prominent commentators and financial institutions warned that leaving the EU, or even just voting to leave, risked an acute economic crisis and possibly a sudden recession. When this much-anticipated crisis failed to immediately materialise, Brexiteers declared Project Fear and interpreted the lack of crisis as proof that Brexit would ultimately deliver the UK to sunlit uplands. Nearly a decade on from the referendum, however, and not only the uplands not looking particularly sunny, but there's now a pretty strong consensus that, even if there wasn't an immediate crisis, in the long run, Brexit has been really quite terrible for the UK economy. Two papers published in recent months confirmed this. The first, titled The Economic Impact of Brexit 9 Years On, was published in June by John Springford at the Centre for European Reform, and it basically uses what's known as a doppelganger to estimate how the UK economy would have fared without Brexit. For context, in the Brexit-related economic literature, a doppelganger is basically a mishmash of other countries that's calibrated to mimic a particular economy, usually the UK. Doppelgangers can help you figure out the impact of some big macroeconomic shock, like Brexit, because they provide a pretty great independent control. Assuming the countries you used to create the doppelganger in the first place weren't affected by that same shock, the doppelganger allows you to see how the affected economy would have likely performed without that shock. In this paper, Springford essentially created a doppelganger UK that tracked the UK's economic performance between the financial crisis in 2008 and the Brexit referendum in 2016. Specifically, the doppelganger UK was 31% the US, 15% Germany, 14% New Zealand, 8% Norway and 5% Australia, with a number of mostly European countries, each accounting for less than 5% of the total, making up the remainder. Springford then compared the doppelganger's economic performance in the years since the referendum with the UK's actual economic performance to get a sense of how Brexit affected the UK economy. And, well, it doesn't make for happy reading. When it comes to GDP growth, the doppelganger grew by about 14% between Brexit and 2023, roughly on par with the US, while the actual UK economy only grew by about 8%, closer to its European neighbours like France and Germany. The implication here is that Brexit has caused something like a 6% hit to the UK's long-run growth rate. The second paper on our list, titled simply The Economic Impact of Brexit, and published as a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper in December, is even more negative. Using a combination of doppelganger and more traditional forecasting techniques, the authors estimate that by 2025, Brexit had reduced UK GDP by 6 to 8%. Even worse than that first paper. This all implies that the OBR's original forecast that Brexit would reduce the UK's long-run productivity by roughly 4% was actually too optimistic, despite the fact it was rubbished as yet more Project Fear in the aftermath of the referendum. That OBR forecast estimated that such a decline would equate to a loss of around £4,000 per household and roughly £40 billion in lost tax revenues. If these papers are to be believed, the real impact could be twice that. Now, you might naturally assume this is mostly a consequence of the impact that Brexit had on the UK's trading relationships. And it is true that Brexit did have a negative effect on UK trade. The UK's total exports, including to both the EU and the rest of the world, have fallen by 15% compared to the doppelganger. The UK's exports to both the EU and the rest of the world fell by similar amounts after Brexit, which is sometimes touted as proof that Brexit didn't actually hurt the UK economy as much as expected, given that you'd expect Brexit to mean a steeper drop in exports to the EU. However, the doppelganger's overperformance suggests a more plausible explanation is that Brexit-related disruption to UK-EU supply chains both directly reduced the UK's exports to the EU, but also pushed up costs for UK manufacturers more generally, leading to a decline in exports across the board. But while a decline in trade has indeed contributed to the UK's economic underperformance since Brexit, declines in investment, as a consequence of Brexit-related uncertainty, have played at least as big a role. According to that first paper we mentioned, the UK's total private sector investment fell by about 10% compared to the doppelganger. You can sort of see this if you just look at ONS data. Investment flatlined after the referendum and has only really returned to its pre-2016 trend line in the past year or so. This has been truly terrible for the UK economy, and at least partly explains why productivity has been so sluggish in the years since. The silver lining here is that both public and private sector investment are finally rising again, meaning the UK economy should see some benefits in the relatively near term. So, you get the idea. Economically, Brexit has been a bit of a failure. It should come as little surprise then to find out that, politically, it's not going great either. The latest YouGov polling suggests that 61% of Brits think Brexit has been more of a failure than a success, compared with just 13% who think it's been more of a success. Similarly, 56% of Brits think it was wrong for Britain to vote to leave the EU, while only 31% continue to say it was the right decision. But, despite all this, Brexit is, politically speaking, the dog that won't bark. Labour don't want to talk about it, and it doesn't seem to have hurt Nigel Farage electorally, despite the fact that roughly 2/3 of Brits hold him responsible for Brexit's failures. This is for a variety of reasons, including that Labour are scared of a topic that has proved electorally toxic for them in the past, and that any deepening of the existing UK-EU relationship would require difficult negotiations with the EU, who were, understandably, scarred by the chaos of Brexit. Nonetheless, if economic growth continues to prove elusive, and regret continues to grow, political gravity might push Starmer into rethinking the current arrangement. We're taking a break from regularly posting over the festive period, but if you did want more from TLDR, then check out our magazine Too Long, which is also available as a digital edition, so you can start reading instantly. Obviously, the cover story is called The New Middle East, but there's much more than that, with full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The EU section includes our interview with fellow creator Money and Macro, where we discuss how to fix the European economy, Macron's fall from grace, and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, as well as our rundown of the biggest elections that happened in 2025. And our UK section runs through the rise of a new left, why next year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategies Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. Digital and physical editions are available right now, with physical editions shipping in the new year and digital copies being sent straight to your inbox. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special end-of-year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use code December25 at checkout. Find out more by heading to toolong.news or by clicking the link in the description.